Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol. Foreword. Critics and translators have agreed that Dead Souls is one of the great novels of the world and that Gogol is as great a novelist as Tolstoy and Turgenev. Critics and translators are, of course, usually clever men, but Mr. McAndrew, the translator of the present version, seems to have realized that we may not all be so clever as that and has provided a note of his own to explain some of the difficulties the reader may encounter. All these I encountered myself and a few more, and perhaps the best service I can do to the reader is to indicate how not to approach the book. I read it first when I was 17 or 18 and mad on Russian fiction. I thought it a great bore. It seemed to me to have the same relation to the great Russian masterpieces that Pickwick had to the great English ones, except that in those days I wasn't sure that the English could write novels at all. To begin with, the subject was alien, and in spite of all I have read in the meantime, it remains alien. It describes how a rogue called Chichikov acquires legal ownership of dead slaves and pays the taxes on them so as later to take out a mortgage on this non-existent property. Maybe somebody from Georgia or Alabama will accept this without question. I didn't. Some Russian critics argue that it was impossible because Chichikov would have had to buy living dependents as well. Mr. McAndrew believes it was possible, and I accept his word for it, but it doesn't really matter. When one is reduced to discussing whether or not the subject of a novel is possible, one has already admitted that it is something other than a novel, and it was the novel that I was interested in. So, though I continued to accept piously the view of critics and translators, it was with a certain feeling of resentment, such as one bears toward a bad teacher who says, quote, "Of course it's simply wonderful in Russian," end of quote. That sort of phrase always gives me the feeling that someone is playing me for a sucker. If the book is as good as that in Russian, then it should be all right in English. After all, I didn't know any Russian in the days when I first knew that Tolstoy and Turgenev were wonderful. No great novel depends upon style. It depends on character and incident, and these have been known to survive much mistranslation. I reread the book more carefully in my late 20s when I had learned enough Russian to read occasional stories in the original to see what I might have missed in English. In fairness to the translators, I must admit that I didn't seem to have missed much, but I still made no headway with Dead Souls. Next time I reread it, I was really desperate and scratched the surface for meaning like an industrious old dog who knows there is a particularly juicy bone buried somewhere, if only he can find it. I am not, of course, suggesting that anything of the kind will happen to the reader of the present version. I am merely trying to point out what can happen between a quite diligent reader and a masterpiece when, for some reason, the reader approaches it wrongly. I certainly approached Dead Souls wrongly. I was looking in it for something I should have defined vaguely as the Russian note, and there was no one to tell me that this note really appeared in Russian literature with Turgenev, and that even then it was not entirely Russian and could also be found in the work of an English novelist called Trollope, whom I hadn't even read. There was no one to tell me that for all he suffered on Gogol's account, Turgenev was as much in revolt against him as Flaubert was against Balzac and Trollope against Dickens. Quote, "I am feeling more and more where Gogol's shoe pinches," end of quote, wrote Turgenev. Quote, "The striving after impartiality and integral truth is one of the few good qualities for which I am grateful to nature," end of quote. In other words, impartiality and integral truth, the qualities I loved in Tolstoy and Turgenev, were qualities I should not have looked for in Gogol. They weren't there. I had been making the one mistake a critic must not make in reading literature outside its historical context. And oh dear, the difference it made when I reread Gogol with Turgenev's words in mind and realized that he really belonged to a period of the novel when all the 18th century restraints were being thrown aside, when order, moderation, design, and credibility were being sacrificed for the sense of abounding, tumultuous, emotional life, the period of Dickens and Balzac. I could have seen it for myself on the very first page if only I had known how to read. Quote, "Its occupant was a gentleman who was surely no Adonis, but whose appearance was not too unprepossessing either. He was neither too fat nor too thin, nor could he be described as either old or young," end of quote. Plainly, this is a generalization, and it is not one that Turgenev or Tolstoy could have indulged in. And when I read the book nowadays, it leaps at me off the page, as do scores of other generalizations like this. Quote, "That's a Russian for you. He has a passion for knowing anyone superior to him, if only a notch, and a nodding acquaintance with a count or prince is more important to him than the closest friendship with an ordinary citizen, end of quote. So just as Turgenev and Tolstoy were seeking for integral truth, the specific truth about certain people in certain situations, Gogol, like Balzac, was seeking for the general truth about most people in most situations. In reading Balzac, it is hard not to become aware of the generalizations. 3 to the page, as I once ruefully calculated. But it is probably a sign of Gogol's supreme artistry that one can read Dead Souls right through again and again, as I did, without being aware that almost every page contains a generalization, such as, in general, our people are not too successful with representative institutions. Soviet papers, please copy. Or, quote, it must be noted that if we in Russia have still not caught up with the foreigner in certain matters, we have clearly surpassed him in the art of human relations. It is well nigh impossible to list all the nuances with which we address various people, end of quote. Generalizations, but with what a difference. Dickens made his to force people into a moral pattern. Balzac made his to force characters and events into what he honestly believed to be the very latest scientific patterns. Gogol, who was no social critic, was all too innocent of scientific patterns and never by any chance up to date, made his generalizations so as to relate his characters and events to an older, more Christian, medieval pattern. Every man as he appeared in Holy Russia, and here, for once, he really is Russian and nothing else. One has only to read those last marvelous paragraphs. Quote, and you, Russia, aren't you racing headlong like the fastest troika imaginable? The road smokes under you, bridges rattle, and everything falls behind. A passerby stops and gapes at this miraculous vision. He wonders whether it wasn't a stroke of lightning. He ponders the meaning of this awe-inspiring speed and wonders what unknown force drives these mysterious steeds. Oh, horses, horses! Are there cyclones concealed in your names? It's actually manes. Are there cyclones concealed in your manes? Do your sensitive ears transmit fire to your very veins? No sooner do you hear the familiar song from above than the muscles of your chests of bronze become taut and hard, and, barely touching the earth, you become streamlined, a flow of air, and the whole troika flies along, inspired by God. And where do you fly to, Russia? Answer me. She doesn't answer. The carriage bell breaks into an enchanted tinkling. The air is torn to shreds and turns into wind. Everything on earth flashes past and casting worried sidelong glances. Other nations and countries step out of her way, end of quote. Dickens was quite capable of such an invocation as this, but it would have been addressed to Christmas, quote, season of love that will yet extend from the 1st of January to the 31st of December, end of quote. So was Balzac, but his would have been addressed to science, quote, thou from whose glorious beams superstition shrinks away, cowering in the shades, end of quote. Gogol's inspiration was nothing less than all Russia. I suggest then that if the reader listens for this note, quote, like all Russian towns, end of quote, quote, like many officials in Russia, end of quote, quote, like a number of Russian homes, end of quote, he will leave himself open to the real shock of Gogol, the realization that by means of generalization heaped upon generalization, fantastic type upon fantastic type, Gogol creates a picture of Imperial Russia more convincing than any he will find in the later Russian novelists. And that though the reader might have traveled right through Russia in the first half of the 19th century without ever encountering a typical figure from Tolstoy or Turgenev, he would scarcely have traveled 100 miles before meeting someone like Nozdrov, Manilov, Sobakevich, or Nastasia Petrovna Korobachka. Gogol himself was perfectly aware of this. Quote, chances are that the reader is familiar with faces like Nozdrov's. Everyone has met many people of his sort. They are described as easygoing fellows, passed for good friends from childhood and school days on. And yet, now and then, they receive quite painful beatings. There is frankness, openness, and daring in their expressions. They are quick to make friends with you. And before you know it, they are addressing you familiarly. It looks as if their friendship will last till the grave, but it somehow always happens that you fall out on the very first evening at the very first celebration of the friendship. End of quote. It is interesting to watch how the generalization develops, growing more certain with every touch. Quote, like all his kind, Nozdrov had a weakness for cards, end of quote. And then suddenly the generalization expands to its limit so far as Gogol's knowledge extended. Quote, and the strangest thing about it, a thing which could happen only in Russia, was that after a short interval of time, he again met with the same friends as though nothing had happened. and there never seemed to be a grudge either on their side or on his. End of quote. It is the final generalization, the generalization that relates Nozdrov and his friends to Russian society as a whole, which clinches the character in our imaginations and makes us realize that we have known him ourselves. For this is one of the paradoxes of great fiction, that when we have been persuaded that some character is possible, even if only in Russia, we recognize that we have always known him ourselves. Nastasia Petrovna, when I met her last, was running an illegal tavern in the wilds of Connemara, and trying to find someone who would bribe the headmistress of the school her stupid daughter attended to get her through examinations. The later history of Dead Souls is tragedy. By the time he wrote the last triumphant address to Russia, Gogol realized that he had succeeded, that his novel transcended Chichikov and Russia itself, that it dealt with the whole mystery of human life, and that he, like Shakespeare or Dante, must be prepared with an answer to its problems. He wrote the second part of Dead Souls, and the friends to whom he read it were convinced that it was quite as great as the first. But Gogol, his mind disturbed by some religious crisis, was dissatisfied, and shortly before he died, he burned the manuscript and sobbed his heart out. A few chapters from the second part are often printed, but they are only first or second drafts, and an insult to the memory of a great perfectionist. We shall never know what that second part was like, or by what weary steps Chichikov, meaning ourselves, neither good-looking nor ugly, neither too fat nor too thin, neither old nor young, climbed the long road toward God and Beatrice, because after he had traveled 2/3 of the way, Gogol himself despaired and committed the only suicide that matters to a writer. But the very greatness of the aim suggested in the act of destruction is itself an indication to the reader of what he may expect to find in this marvelous book. Foreword by Frank O'Connor.